If I hold it to my mouth, you can hear me. Okay, good. Let's begin with the word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we gather this morning in your presence, aware of the many blessings that you bring to our lives, aware of the promises that you have made first to our ancestors and now to us. We seek your wisdom and your guidance as we remember some of the stories this morning, some of the stories of our faith and of our faith family. We ask that you would speak to our hearts and to our minds. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. I understand that this class is working your way all the way through the Bible, that you started in Genesis a few days ago. Yes? And are now up to, is it Ephesians? Yes. So you're beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The New Jerusalem, I suppose, in heaven. And I'm just curious, how many of you have been a part of this entire journey, have been coming since Genesis was started? Excellent. All right. So anything that we do today is review for you, right? Because I do Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And so we're going to back up today to some stories that are a little older than what you've been talking about in the most recent time. Before I get started, I want to say just a word about study Bibles. Do most of you have a study Bible that you use and feel comfortable with? Okay. I encourage everybody to have at least one study Bible because of the incredible amount of help you can get in making sense of what you're reading by having the notes along the side or at the bottom of the page that fill out some of the historical information for you that remind you of things that you may have learned here, but it helps to see it in writing when you're actually looking at a passage. The Oxford Annotated is an excellent study Bible. The HarperCollins is an excellent study Bible. The New Interpreter's Study Bible is excellent. I have brought a study Bible this morning that I'm guessing none of you own. This is the Jewish Study Bible. Anybody here who has it? Okay. Well, this is obviously a translation that comes out of the Jewish Publication Society. It is a Bible that does not include the New Testament, right? Okay. And it is a fascinating Bible for us as Christians to use, not as our first source, but as our second source, as a way of getting some different understandings of the text that we read. And when you look at the notes in this Bible, a lot of the information you find will be similar, a lot of the historical information, so it will be similar to what you have in your other study Bibles, but then you'll also get exposed to some of the rabbinic traditions that underlie some of these texts, and it will invite you to think about these stories in a new way. So this morning, I'm going to give you a little bit of that information, but also the translation that we're using is the Tanakh. I won't go into all the details of where that came from unless somebody asks me. I'll do it next week. But again, the purpose in using a translation that is not familiar is that it makes us stop and think about the stories. When you're used to hearing the same words over and over again, it's easy just to fall into the rote of it and not really to engage it. And so this morning I'm going to be using a translation that may not sound as familiar as what you're used to, and that's a good thing, right? Good. Okay. I also brought with me the New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version, as well as the Hebrew in the middle, so we can check because it's always good to compare translations, right? I thought that it would be interesting today to go back to the beginning of Exodus and to read the first chapter, the story of the Hebrew midwives, one of my most favorite stories in all of the scriptures. And then lead between today and next week when I'll be back, lead into the story of the birth of Moses. This is one of those stories that is reasonably familiar to us, right? But how long has it been since you actually read it? Okay. So, just a word about my style, which actually is I was pleased to see that Dr. Biggs does a similar thing. I really think that close reading of the biblical text is important, because any time we sit down to read one of these stories, floating around in our minds, whether it's conscious or subconscious, are all the songs we learned in Sunday school, the sermons that we've heard preached, the stories that our grandparents told us, the stories that we've told our grandchildren, right? And all of the movies that we've seen that have contributed, the books that we've read that have contributed to our understanding of these stories. Many of us have been shaped, for instance, by Cecil B. DeMille in our understanding of the Moses story, right? Exodus, yes. And sometimes it's helpful to think about where all of our information comes from and go back and read the text and see if what we read here actually matches what we remember or not. Because sometimes we discover that there are things here we didn't know, or that there are things we were sure were here, and they're not. And it's helpful to see what it is that the Holy Scripture actually has to say. The other piece of this is that the biblical texts, because they tell stories that are all related to each other and are all a part of our faith tradition, whenever we read one of them, in our minds we are also being reminded of other stories. And I think it's a helpful enterprise as we read to stop and remember some of those other stories, because they help to shed light then on what we're reading. So, here's my procedure. We begin by reading the text, and then we stop and ask all kinds of questions. And some of our questions are historical, and some of our questions are literary, and some of our questions are about, now what happened before in this biblical story? And so we might go in lots of different directions, and we might spend lots of time dealing with just one verse, but when we come back then to the story, we come back with a richer understanding as we move into the next verse. Are you with me on that? Okay? All right. So here we go. I'm in Exodus chapter 1, and it begins in a very exciting, dramatic way. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher." Are you excited now? What kind of a story begins with a list of names of people who aren't even a part of the story? Huh? Well, a story that wants to remind you of your past, right? A story that wants you to be able to identify, oh yeah, this is my family. Do you think about the people who are in the biblical stories as a part of your faith family? I do. When I read these stories, for me, it's a genealogy. I'm looking back at the people in my own past, and here they are, and I can identify with them, and I can remember things about them. It was important in ancient Israel to keep track of genealogies, It was important to pay attention to bloodlines. It was important to know who belonged to which tribe. And these texts, this is where they reminded themselves of this story. All right, so let's think about who Jacob was. Do you remember who Jacob's father was? Isaac, absolutely. And do you remember who Jacob's grandfather was? Abraham. And perhaps you remember the promises that God made to Abraham. Promise of land. And, more significantly for this story, the promise of many, 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 many descendants. God said, I will bless you, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. And at various points in Genesis, God says to Abraham, try to count the number of stars in the sky, and you're going to have more descendants than that. Try to count the dust of the earth, and you're going to have more descendants than that. So here we are being reminded, these are descendants who carry the promise from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and then we name the sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. They get a verse all to themselves. Just so you remember, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, and that is an age order for them, were born to Leah. Leah was Jacob's first wife, but not his first love. Right? Do you remember the story? Back in Genesis? How Jacob fell in love with beautiful Rachel and thought that he had worked out a deal with Laban to marry her, and woke up on his wedding night to discover that no, he had just married her older sister, Leah. And then he had to promise to work another 7 years in order to marry Rachel as well. And then we have, this is in chapter 30 of Genesis, we have all of these interactions between Rachel and Leah where they're competing over having children. Remember, this is the part of the blessing. And especially for women in that day and age, bearing male children, that was your sign of honor and acceptance in the community, and your sign of whether you were blessed by God or not. And in fact, the biblical text tells us that God had compassion on Leah because God realized that Rachel was the one Jacob really loved. So God gave lots of children to Leah and closed Rachel's womb. Do you remember that? So the first 4 sons were born to Leah, and Rachel just couldn't stand it. And she actually went to Jacob and said, we have to have some sons. Give me some sons. And Jacob said, hey, you think I'm God? I'm not the one who can control that. And so, go back and read it. It's in there. And so, Rachel decided, okay, take my handmaid, my servant Bilhah, and have children with her. And so Jacob did that, and that's how Dan and Naphtali were born. Well, after that happened, Leah decided, if her handmaid can have children, mine can too. And so she presented Zilpah to Abraham, and Zilpah bore him 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. And then there was this very interesting story where one of Leah's sons, Reuben, do you remember this? He found some mandrakes out in his playtime one day when he was out wandering around, and he brought them home. And mandrakes were important because they were, I'm not sure whether they were considered aphrodisiacs or if they were considered fertility drugs. But the idea was that a woman who had access to mandrakes could have children. And Rachel so desperately wanted to have children that she arranged with Leah to purchase the mandrakes. Leah said, I will let you have my son's mandrakes if you will tell Jacob he has to sleep with me. And so that's what they did. And Jacob agreed and slept with Leah, and 2 more sons were born, Issachar and Zebulun. And then finally, God had compassion on Rachel, and she bore her first son. You remember his name? Joseph. Now, in our biblical text here, we're in Exodus chapter 1, the first 4 verses. We list 11 of the sons. And the order in which they're listed is Leah's sons are listed first. Rachel's son is next. And then the secondary sons, the sons of the handmaids, are listed last. I think that tells us something about the level of prestige, right, that these offspring had. But Joseph isn't even mentioned yet. Why? because this is the list of the sons who came with Jacob to Egypt. You remember the story of how the whole family got to Egypt, right? You remember that because Joseph was Rachel's first child, Jacob loved him the best, right? When he was a little kid growing up. Showed him favoritism, made a fancy outfit for him. We talk about it as the coat of many colors. The Hebrew text really says something like long-sleeved shirt. My seminary professor used to say it was made out of his mother's wedding dress. Now that's, but the idea is that's how important it was, right? It was a very special garment and something that could be easily recognized from a distance. You remember maybe that Joseph was a little bit of a brat growing up? Yes? He knew he was special and he kind of rubbed it into his brothers, and he used to have dreams, and God gave him the ability to interpret the dreams, and instead of, sort of keeping that as a private gift, he would go around and tell everybody, you're going to serve me someday. Here's the dream I had, right? And his brothers didn't like that very much. So it made them angry. And one day they finally acted on their anger, and you remember the story of how Joseph first was thrown into a pit and then was sold to some travelers who took him to Egypt. And that's how Joseph got to Egypt. And then there's this amazing story again about God's blessing and about the gift that Joseph had for dreams and interpretations. And because of God's blessing and because of those gifts, he rose to a position of prominence, so that when the day came that there was famine in the land, and it was a struggle for Jacob and the rest of his family to eat, Jacob, who thought Joseph was dead, and the rest of his family to eat, the brothers, the ones who are named here, minus Benjamin the first time, traveled to Egypt in order to get grain so that their family could survive. And Joseph recognized them, but they did not know him. Do you remember this? Yes. They went home, everybody was happy, had enough to eat for a while. When they needed more grain, the only way that they had been told they could get more grain is if they brought their other brother with them, Benjamin. But Benjamin was the only remaining child of Rachel. He was the youngest of the children, and Rachel had died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. By the way, she named him Benoni, the son of my sorrow, and Jacob changed his name to Benjamin, the son of my right hand. So all kinds of things happened, and I don't want to do all the details of the story, but you know them, or you could go back and read them, about how they traveled again to see Joseph. Benjamin was arrested. Essentially, one of the brothers had to stand up for Joseph. You know the whole story. Finally, Joseph revealed himself, and there was a grand reunion of the family. And Joseph talked to the Pharaoh and got special permission for his family to move to Egypt. And so it was a good thing originally when Jacob and his sons moved to Egypt. But Jacob made it clear when he made the move that he wanted to be buried back at home. Because after all, remember the promises to Abraham. There were two of them. One was that we'll have many descendants, and the other was that we're going to have the land of Canaan as our own. Jacob said, I want to be buried in my own land. So sure enough, after the death of Jacob, Joseph arranged with the Pharaoh for a group to travel together to take Jacob home and bury him. When Joseph himself died, he made the same request for his own bones. And for some reason, 400 years later, when we get to Exodus chapter 1, the bones of Joseph are still in Egypt. Which means, if we're thinking about it and paying attention, it means that they're not going to be in Egypt forever. But sometimes things happen in their own time or in God's time. So these are the names of the sons of Israel. So we have all of these stories going about in our heads as we begin to read about Exodus. We're remembering how the family came to be there. We're remembering who the family is. Verse 6 tells us, and Joseph, verse 5, the total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70. Joseph being already in Egypt, and that's the first mention of Joseph. He was already there. 70, is a number of perfection, a number of completeness, a very important number. And so we're talking presumably about sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, and maybe we're including the women. It's not entirely clear. We know, for instance, that Leah gave birth to at least one daughter. Her name was Dinah. Mm-hmm. And presumably there were others whose names we just don't happen to know. But the total number who went down to Egypt with Jacob was 70. Then Joseph died. I'm in verse 6 now. And all his brothers and all of that generation. Now what does that tell us? It's the end of one chapter and the beginning of a new. Walter Brueggemann says that the way Exodus begins accomplishes two very important purposes. One is that it sets up this incredible contrast, because if we didn't already know what was coming, we would assume that things are going well. And that assumption is about to be reinforced in the next verse. So that when things do go badly quickly, we're struck by the irony of it and by the tragedy of it. But at the same time, Walter Brueggemann says, we're being reminded before we ever enter the tragic part of the story of the stability of the promises of God. The promises and the blessings that in this case take the form of descendants. The children are the blessings. And so even as we enter into the tragedy, we go in with a memory, but God has promised something else. Okay. And verse 7, just one of my favorite verses. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and increased very, very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. Do you have any questions about what that verse means? 4 verbs, just in case one wasn't enough. They were fruitful and prolific and multiplied and spread everywhere. This is the thing that the Israelites, the Hebrews, were the best at. Having children, as the story is told to us. Why? Because that was God's promise to them. This is going to be their strength, and it's also the thing that's going to put them in danger. Okay. When you hear the words fruitful and multiply, what images come to your mind? Do you go clear back to creation? This is the very first instruction that God ever gave to human beings. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. You remember that from Genesis chapter 1? Well, it's happening. In fact, one of these verbs in here, not the fruitful and multiply, but the other one, I heard a teacher at a school one time suggest that this is the word you might use of cockroaches. Or maybe rabbits, if that's a nicer image for you. They were having children right and left. That's the idea. Okay? They started with 70 in Egypt, and now they're filling the whole land. Okay? This is a sign of God's blessing and God's promise. So we're being reminded both of God at creation and the instructions that God gave, and of the blessing that God gave to Abraham. This is a good thing that they're having all these children. Okay, now the story's actually going to begin. You ready? Okay. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Wow. All right. Well, it makes sense that, the original Pharaoh would have died, but what does this mean? A new king who did not know Joseph. Presumably, many pharaohs had died between the time of arrival and the time of the Exodus. But perhaps this is the first one who either didn't know the story of how these Israelites had come to be, these Hebrews, had come to be in Egypt, or who knew the story and didn't care. Right? Now there are some historical critics who have looked at this passage, a new king arose over Egypt, and have gone back to look at Egyptian history to see if they could figure out a time when this must have happened. And there are really two main arguments for dates for the Exodus. One of them is related to the rise of a people called the Hyksos into leadership in Egypt. And the Hyksos, we don't know anything much about them, but they seemed to be people from the north, Asiatic peoples, and so the thought was, well, maybe that's a description of Joseph and his descendants. And people who make that argument will date to the 15th century, to the 1400s BCE. Scholars have questioned some of the evidence that is used in making that case for a variety of reasons. And so the more commonly accepted date is actually based not on this verse, but later when we get to the reference about the building of storehouses, to Ramses II, whom we know did not necessarily those specific projects, but we know that he did building projects in which he enlisted. He had a corvée, and so he enlisted people to do the physical labor, both foreigners and his own people, to do the work. And if we date this to Ramses, then that puts the Israelites entering Canaan in the 12th century, and we have some other archaeological evidence that suggests that timing is about right in terms of when villages began to spring up in Israel. So that's the more commonly accepted version, and in the Jewish Study Bible, that's what they opt for. I have to tell you, I hope that Dr. Biggs has prepared you for this kind of thing, but if he hasn't, I will throw it out there just for you to think. There are some scholars who look at the history, the origins of the Israelite people, and say, because we don't have very much historical evidence outside of the biblical story itself, and the biblical story was not written specifically to be a history in the way that you and I might write history today. It was written as a faith story. And because when historians do their work, they usually like to have corroborating sources. And they prefer to have things that are dug up, right? So that they can compare it. If they're doing archaeology, for instance, they dig something up and they can compare it to the other items that are around, and they can draw conclusions that go beyond just a single item. The Bible wasn't dug up. It was passed down. And so it has been through many generations of hands, which makes it an incredibly important book for Christians and for Jews, right. But for historians, it is not considered the most reliable source for this early history that can't be corroborated by anything else. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Okay. So some scholars, this was a couple hundred years ago, some scholars sat down and took the figures about how many people crossed the Red Sea and how long it took them and all those kinds of things, and did the math to determine logistically what it would take to move that many people from one place to another, in addition to all the problems in trying to locate where this crossing happened. But they would have to have columns 3 miles wide, and it was going to take months for people to get across. And the question is, it's not whether you believe in miracles or not. It's a question of whether it is even physically, logistically possible for those particular details in the Exodus story to be historically, factually accurate. So there are a lot of scholars who say, okay, what we have in the Exodus story is not necessarily a historical account of what happened to the Hebrew people. What we have is a faith story that helps people understand their identity as Hebrews. And one theory, which Norman Gottwald was sort of the granddaddy of this, but other people have picked it up well, and he learned it from his professor Mendenhall. No idea is totally original. Yes? Okay. But Gottwald's idea was this. The thing that drew Israelites together was their shared faith in Yahweh. Their shared faith in the same God, who was different from all the Canaanite gods around them. And that there were families, there were tribes that came together and embraced Yahweh together. And each tribe had its own history, had its own stories in its background, and its own important people. So there was an Abraham tribe, and an Isaac tribe, and a Jacob tribe, and a Moses tribe. And that the stories that we have in Genesis and in Exodus are weavings together of these traditions to bring all these tribes into a single family, to help them feel connected. And so scholars who accept this model of how the nation of Israel eventually came to be look back at the Exodus story and say, well, this probably was a tradition for one of those tribes. There probably was something that happened in Egypt. There probably was some kind of a story that is being contained for us and told for us here. It just didn't apply to everybody, right? And the main piece of evidence in support of at least a kernel of history here is the very name of Moses, which is actually an Egyptian name. We'll talk about that more next week. So most scholars think that this story does have some kind of validity in that sense, but the task of trying to go back and date it and establish some kind of specific history and to say this is what happened, we really don't have the evidence that we need in order to be able to do that definitively. Okay? Are you all with me on that? Makes sense to you. Okay. And the reason I brought it up is a new king arose over Egypt, and people who are interested in trying to establish that history put great significance on this verse. They try to figure out who that new king is. Now let me tell you another interesting thing about it. Notice that we've been given the names of all these descendants of Abraham, these descendants of Jacob. And we're about to be given the name of two Hebrew midwives. We'll get there in a little bit. But the Pharaoh is not named. He's just the king of Egypt. He's known by his title. Pay special attention when you're reading the biblical texts to who gets named and who doesn't. Usually, when you read these stories, the people, and the names usually mean something, by the way, but the people who are named are the important figures in the story. And the ones who are not named are the ones who are kind of insignificant, who don't really matter. So this is our first exposure to the irony in the telling of this story. The powerful guy, the king of Egypt, is the nameless one. And the powerless and the oppressed are called by their names. Okay, that's significant. Sorry, I just had a New Testament moment. And Jesus calls us by our names, right? Okay, sorry. Try not to do that too much. Okay, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, which may mean that he just didn't know wasn't aware of the history, or it may be that he was aware of the history and disregarded it. And he said to his people, now listen to this complaint. Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. So that's what they did that got them into trouble. They had too many children. The blessing of God, right, which is the thing that made them strong, is also the thing that got them into trouble. He said, the people are much too numerous for us. Verse 10, let us deal shrewdly with them. The word that's translated here to deal shrewdly, let's see what the other translations say. It's about the same. Deal shrewdly. All three say deal shrewdly. The word actually is from chacham, which is the word for wisdom. Let's be wise about this, the Pharaoh says. Now here's what's funny. You're laughing already. Here's what's funny about it. He says, we're going to be wise, and then he makes all the most foolish decisions. Let's watch. Let's just see how wise this Pharaoh is. He's trying. Let us deal shrewdly with it. By the way, it's okay to laugh at the Pharaoh. Did you know that there's humor in the Bible? There really is, and it's okay to be struck by it. Okay. Sometimes because we read it in church and we read it very somberly, we forget. But ancient peoples had a sense of humor too, and the text even suggests to us that God has a sense of humor sometimes. Ooh, okay. So the king said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Here's why. So that they may not increase. We're going to impose birth control on these people so they'll quit growing so fast. Otherwise, and now here's his fear, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us. And this text says, and rise from the ground, although it gives us other, this is one of those places where the Hebrew text says one thing and then the Greek says something else, and you have to decide which manuscript to go with. So most of them will say, go up from the land. They will go up from the land, meaning escape. So here's what he's saying. If they get to be too many, they may side with our enemies and fight against us and leave us, and we won't have them around anymore. So he's upset that there are too many, and he wants to keep them. So he wants to reduce how many there are. Does that make sense? Well, in Pharaoh logic, it does. Okay. Part of what's interesting, I think, about this is that he seems to assume automatically that they're going to turn against him, which says something about his particular relationship with these people, which is perhaps what we were being told in the earlier verse about he knew not Joseph, right? We don't know what kind of relationship earlier pharaohs may or may not have had, except for the one who actually brought Joseph up and appointed him. But this one, clearly, he perceives the Hebrew people as adversaries. He wants to control them. There are too many of them. All right, I'm going to try not to get political. Okay. They might fight against us, and they might escape. All right, so here's his solution. This is how he's going to impose birth control. So they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Pithom and Ramses. Garrison cities is one translation. A lot of the translations will say storage cities. It's a question okay, here we go. Garrison cities means we're contributing to the fortification, right? We're contributing to the defense of Egypt. So he's enlisting people who might become his enemies to help build his defenses, right? Or storehouses, meaning that the Egyptian leadership is still in control of all of the grain that is produced. I don't know if you remember this part of the story, but at the time of the famine, when Joseph first rose to power in Egypt, he came up with this idea of let's build a store. Well, he had a dream. God revealed it to him. And he said, let's build these storehouses and people can come to us for our food. And the Egyptians were doing that. And what happened was that the government ended up owning all the land because the Egyptians kept having to come to them for their food. So Walter Brueggemann points out when we get to this part of the story that these cities, whether they're garrison cities or whether they're storage cities, that these cities themselves tell us that there was still a high level of oppression even among Egyptians themselves. There was a big divide between the haves and the have-nots. Right? So, yes, the Hebrew people were a part of this, but they were not the only ones who were experiencing this kind of domination. Okay. And again, historically, we do have evidence of some pharaohs, such as Ramses II, who did conscript both their own people and foreigners into service for them. All right. So, but in the terms of the story, here's what's happening. The Pharaoh wants to exercise birth control, wants to stop the increase of children among the Israelites, and so his solution is we're going to make them work really hard. I guess on the theory that they'll all be too tired for anything else. Right? Does this sound to you like a good plan? Okay. He's trying to be wise now, shrewd. Verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. His plan totally backfired. The harder they worked, I don't want to get too graphic, but the harder they worked, the harder they played at home, and they ended up having more and more children. Right? God's blessing is more powerful than the Pharaoh of Egypt, right? That's what we're learning in this story. Of course, we knew it before we started, but here it is in the story. And so the fear just got worse and worse. Now, biblical scholars who are source critics, are you familiar with the sources in the biblical text? Okay. So you have the J and E, which are the really old, early traditions, we think. And then you have the D source, which is mostly Deuteronomy and involved in some of the prophets. And then you have the P source, the priestly source, that goes back and collects all of these traditions together and provides some editorial along the way while editing these various traditions and stories together. I have to tell you that that's the predominant understanding of how the sources worked and how these texts came to be. But then in the last 10 to 15 years, there are some very heavy-hitting scholars who have begun to question the amount of some of the dates that people have associated and the orders in which these were made. And so there's an argument, for instance, that the J source, which we traditionally think is the oldest one, actually is the youngest one. So all this stuff is up in the air right now among biblical scholars, and all you need to care about, as far as I'm concerned, is just remembering that all of these biblical texts came from lots of different places and have been pulled together and woven together, and so there's some complexity in the history that's being told. Do we all agree about that? Okay. So, source critics will say that the portion of the text that we've just read so far is the JE, is the rural kind of tradition. And that's the part that's all concerned about fertility. And that the next two verses we're about to read come from the priestly tradition that couldn't care less about fertility and was dealing with other issues. What we have is the two side by side told as a story where what we see is an escalation of the hardship on the Israelites. So here we go. Verse 13. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. So this is the notion of enslavement. In verses 13 and 14, this is where the Egyptians took the Hebrews as slaves and worked them as hard as possible, put the taskmasters in there, and made life as miserable for them as they could. This is similar to the verse we saw earlier that used 4 verbs to tell us how many children the Israelites were having. This time, the word ruthlessly appears twice, the word bitter appears, the word harsh appears. There isn't any doubt in anyone's mind, I suspect, having heard this verse, that the Egyptians were not being nice. Right? Okay? Really, it's important to the text for us to understand how difficult a life the Hebrews were leading under these oppressive Egyptians. Now, those of us who have read ahead know that it's going to get even worse eventually, right? After Moses comes and the Pharaoh gets mad at Moses as an adult, he takes away the straw and they still have to make bricks, right? So what we know from reading ahead is that it could be even more bitter. But nobody wants to live this kind of life. This is pretty bitter. The king of Egypt, who still is not named, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other of whom was named Puah. I should have asked before I read that how many of you remember the names of the midwives. They're not ever mentioned by name again. At least not outside this story. Yeah, I don't think they are here either. But Shiphrah and Puah, these are two names that I think it's worth knowing. This is a little trivia you can use to impress your friends, right? Why? Because in the Bible, people whose names get told, we know that there's something important about them. These two women are going to play a very important role in their dealings with the Pharaoh. Now, here's one of the historical questions we don't know the answer to. Are these women Hebrews who function as midwives among their own people? Or are these women Egyptians whose job it is to help the Hebrew women in their giving birth? You see the difference? And we don't know the answer to that question. The text does not clarify that for us. Why might it matter? Well, it's one thing if you're taking care of your own, and it's another thing if you are a part of the oppressive people, right? And you're siding with the oppressed. Okay, so we don't know about them. What we do know is that the Pharaoh spoke to them. Now I have to say, I'm not sure that we always stop and picture these things in our minds and give a proper appreciation for what it would mean for the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, to have a conversation directly with two women whose job is to be midwives to slaves. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Now, it's possible that when the text says the Pharaoh spoke to these women, what the text means is, and sent a message through a carrier because that was the traditional way that a Pharaoh would speak to somebody. That's possible. But I like to read the story just as it's told and see this king who considers himself wise, who is responding to a perceived threat when nobody has actually done anything to hurt him except just exist, right? And he in his status and power and prestige engages a conversation with these two women, these two lowly midwives. Another part of the irony, I think, in the story. And so he gives them these instructions. When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. And if it is a girl, let her live. Now, first of all, we have to worry about the birth stool. How do you tell the sex of a baby? By looking at the rocks that the mother is sitting on. That's kind of a weird question. But also, just to give you a little information, in the ancient world, we actually have some examples of birth stools from various nations around. And basically, it's one stone that's perpendicular that's parallel to the ground, and another stone that's perpendicular, and the woman sits or crouches. And there's either an indentation or a hole. So birth is done in a crouching position in the ancient Near East. So this is a reference, the birth stool, to the place where where the mother would actually be. Let me see, there was a note here. I want to see what they have to say about this. Let's see. More exactly, the brick or stone supports used by Egyptian women during childbirth. There you go. Okay, I already told you that. So this gives us a little hint into how birth actually happens. By the way, what this means is that the Pharaoh knows and cares about how birth happens, which kind of strikes me a little odd, too. It seems to me that birthstones would not be a normal part of his day-to-day concerns. But okay. When you deliver the woman, look at the birth stool, and if it is a boy, kill him, and if it is a girl, let her live. Now, we have to ask several questions. One of them is, why does it matter? If the issue is there are just too many of them, why does it matter whether it's boys or girls who are living? One of the theories is it's the men who are likely to go to war. And because the Pharaoh has defined this threat as this might be an enemy that lives in our midst that might rise up against us and join our enemies in battle, it's the men who are most likely to do that. So let's just eliminate the male population. The women won't fight, is the assumption. Well, the parallel to that understanding of gender roles, and I guess the women are doing tasks that the Egyptians still appreciated and they don't feel as afraid. But the parallel to that is that the men are also the ones who do the making of the bricks. The men are the ones who are doing the forced labor. And so the Pharaoh is solving his problem by killing off the very people that he's depending on to do his work for him. Does this sound wise or shrewd to you? No. Okay, it's all right to laugh at the Pharaoh. Okay. So these are his instructions. If it's a boy, kill him, and if it's a girl, let her live. Okay, here's the other issue. We all know where babies come from, right? If you kill off the boys and let the girls live, and one boy survives, and that one boy makes every girl pregnant, then you can still have a lot of children, right? If you kill off all the women, doesn't matter how many men there are, even if one survives, you still have only one baby, right? So, again, see the irony in the Pharaoh's logic here? I'm going to impose birth control by preserving the one who actually gives birth, but getting rid of the one who impregnates her. Okay. Now, some of that may have to do with ancient understandings of how birth control works, but I think this part of it would have been well known. Okay. Verse 17. The midwives fearing God. Now, it's probably significant that the name that's being used here is the generic name God and not Yahweh. So we have to assume that we're speaking here about the God of the Hebrews. We're not calling God by name. Probably has to do with which source, which tradition the story comes out of, because before Moses, some of the traditions use the name of Yahweh and some of them don't, because they want to wait until God reveals the name to Moses. So that historically might be an explanation for it. But here we have to go back to our question of whether the midwives were themselves Hebrew or not. So either what we have here is the story of Hebrews who are worshiping their own God, or we have a story of Egyptians who are choosing to worship or to fear the Hebrew God, or of Egyptians who are just concerned about whatever gods might be there, because you know that the generic word that's used for God is always plural, and it can mean gods with a small g and an s on the end. All we know for sure from this text is that the midwives fear divinity. We'll assume it's the Hebrew God that they fear more than they fear Pharaoh. That's what we've learned. That's huge. And again, you get to decide what you think the status of these women is and why they might make that choice. Okay, the midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. Now, I want you to think about this for a minute. You're a person whose livelihood is dependent on working with slaves. You're a nobody in this society. The Pharaoh gives you an order, a direct order, and you decide to disobey? Do you think that requires a little courage? Yes? Do you think that's going to require a little shrewdness? Maybe. Okay. These women are extremely courageous and faithful in some way, because it is their fear of God. However we understand that, they understand that the power of God is greater than the power of the human king, of Pharaoh. Okay, we're getting close on time. I'm trying to decide whether to leave this here. Now let's go. Apparently the Pharaoh hears about the fact that they're being disobedient, or at least he notices that the population is continuing to grow, and it must be their fault, of course. So, verse 18, the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" Now, let me just tell you again, as we examine the character of Pharaoh, if you're the all-powerful person in your nation, and somebody disobeys you, do you really care why? How hard would it be just to, off with their heads and bring in 2 new midwives to do the job? Right? This Pharaoh, I think incompetent is not a strong enough word, okay, to describe him. At least as he's presented in this story. Now remember, this story is being told by Israelites who are remembering their enemy. And so it makes sense that they would make fun of him or put him in a bad light. But anyway, he calls them in and asks them the question, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, talk about shrewd and wise. Okay, midwife said to the Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women." Which, of course, the Pharaoh is going to agree to immediately. It's sort of a racist thing, right? Well, yeah, okay, the Hebrew, in his mind. Of course, the Egyptian women are better. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. The language that's used here sort of reminds you of a wild animal. Okay? They are vigorous. Let's see what the other translations say. Verse 19. Whoops. On the page that I dropped on the floor. Vigorous. Oh, they all say vigorous. Well, there you go. It's full of life is the idea. And because they're vigorous, before the midwife can come to them, they have already given birth. So the idea is these women are out there popping out those babies so fast. They're out doing whatever work they're supposed to do, and then suddenly they're crouching and there's the baby, and by the time we get there, everybody already knows whether it's a boy or a girl and that it was alive, and it's too late for us to do anything about it. Now, when I was a kid and I learned this story, I agonized over this because they lied to Pharaoh. And how could good characters in the Bible, right? How could good people in the Bible deceive anybody? Well, okay, so I've had to get over that a little bit. But also to realize what they're sort of doing here is telling a half-truth. You know? They are clearly being deceptive. I don't think we can let them off the hook. But what they're doing is making the decision to stand up for the lives of the most vulnerable. Right? And so they're giving an explanation that they think the Pharaoh will buy. Because it feeds his sort of racist attitudes. It says, the Hebrew women are different. They're kind of like wild animals. They just give birth like, what we mentioned earlier, rabbits and cockroaches. And so we're helpless. We can't do anything about it. Now here's the amazing thing to me in this story. The Pharaoh evidently accepts their explanation because he doesn't do anything to them. We'll have to pick this up next week and see what happens. But that's the end of the conversation. They give their explanation and okay. So he moves on to his next plan. That's how that works. Are you getting a sense of what's happening here? Okay. And then let's just remember the place that we started, which is, as we read this story, to recognize how it is that the promise, the power, and the blessing of God is stronger than any other power that's out there, including the Pharaoh of Egypt in this story, including the hardship of slavery, including all of the tragedy that is happening or about to happen in this story. What we're discovering all the way through the story is the power of God's blessing. Those babies keep being born. Thank God. Let's have a word of prayer. Oh God, show us your blessings and help us in those times when we struggle to remember the promise and to remember the blessing and to trust in the fulfillment of your promises, especially at those times when it's the most difficult to see. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. And I'll see you next week.